Got it. All right, welcome. Welcome. We are just getting started, running a few minutes late, but we're always on time. This is the Divine Feminine Study Group. Let me just adjust my mic and my camera and turn off my cell phone so we don't hear the reverberation. All righty. Someone is at the door. This is Jessica. Yes, let me just see who is there. We're live here at Triangle Life Center, 950 Bergen Street, Newark, New Jersey. Welcome. Thank you for being your house, Sister Deborah, as I get started. She came home yesterday. God bless. We are continuing to pray for her. Thank you. Thank you for letting us know. And we continue to send up our prayers for her. Just let her know that she's in our thoughts and our prayers for her health and well-being. So we're going to get started. This is our live Tuesday broadcast of the Divine Feminine Study Group. I want to welcome those that will be coming here in person at our Triumph Life Center. You're welcome to stay if you would like. And I also want to welcome those that are joining us via social media on our YouTube channel, Triumph Life Center YouTube channel. Thank you for being here. And those of you that may be watching this at a later time, would you just hit the little bell on the YouTube channel so that you can subscribe? This way in the future, you will get alerts on when we are broadcasting live and what information or what videos we've uploaded. Would you also just hit the like button and share this with someone in your social network? You can let them know that we're here every Tuesday, and I'll tell you more about our summer schedule before we end. But on Tuesdays at 2 o'clock, I do the Divine Feminine live broadcast, Divine Feminine Study Group. And we started last week, and our series topic is Spirituality and Sexuality, a Divine Connection. So as always, I just want to open us up by grounding us in a word of prayer as we just bring ourselves to center with a meditation and just collect our thoughts, collect our energy, and just breathe together some intentional, thoughtful breaths as we share one breath together in our universal humanity. Let us just inhale and exhale deeply. Inhale and exhale. Let's do that one more time. Inhaling and releasing. And as we settle into these sacred temples, our body temple, we offer this teaching, this gathering for our collective uplifting, for our collective knowledge, that it may ignite a spark of learning within us, may challenge us to rethink our ideas about ourselves and others, and may advance our collective community in a positive way. Ashe and Amen. All right. So thank you, Sister Jessica. Sister Jessica is here with me. She's our new team volunteer here at our Life Center. I'm just so happy and grateful for her being and supporting this work. We also have our brother here with us, and thank you for just being here this afternoon, and others may be coming in. So I'm not going to start off by recapping last week. I'm going to ask those of you that missed last week to go back, find the video on YouTube, and just watch that, because it'll be important to just understand what we're doing, what this project is about, and how I plan to move forward over the next 3 weeks. So our goal today, and our goal for the study, is to shed some light on the material facts and what information we do have available to us, what we can know concerning the subjects of sex, sexuality, gender identity, transgenderism, LGBTQIA, and all of those things that I shared last week that's created such conversation and controversy in our communities. So we want to just, from the degree that I can, from my knowledge, from my background, from my training, share with you, not exhaustively, but in a way where it'll spark some additional learning. It may pique your interest to the degree that you say, I never thought about it that way. Or maybe that is something that I need to explore a little more. Okay, so today's lecture is, we're going to be talking about two things, the distinction between sex and gender, and how some biologists argue that sex or gender changes biology. We'll explain more. So first, we're going to talk about sex as a biological category of difference. And I like to explain terms as I introduce terms, even though they may be common to us. Sometimes we hear words and we think about them and we understand them differently. So I will share with you how I'm using these terms. And then next, gender as it has been socially constructed historically. What's the origin of this term or this idea of gender and gender identity? And how is it understood in this current moment? So that's our project for today. So 5 areas I will be covering under these 2 topics. And I'll go through these very meticulously, and we will be under an hour, I promise. That's my commitment, to keep these lectures under an hour for those that are here, those that come on in the Zoom room, or those that watch via YouTube. You're welcome to put a comment in the comment section on the YouTube channel. And before I end, I'll save some time for Q&A. If you want to come into the Zoom room, the Zoom ID where you can connect is 839-018-2053. And the passcode is the letters in all caps TCNA 2023. Okay, so the 5 areas that we're going to break down today are, we're going to answer 5 questions, or at least we're going to explore. Let me put it that way. We're going to explore 5 questions. So the first one is, are sex and gender the same thing? 2, how is one's sex determined? 3, what is the difference between sex and gender? 4, how is one's gender determined? And then 5, does biology drive gender, or does gender drive biology? So those are the 5 areas that I'm going to be exploring with you today. So the first one, are sex and gender the same thing? So I don't know, by show of hands for the few of you that are here, would you say yes or no? Yes? Sex and gender are commonly thought of by many as being the same thing, but they actually are not. There's some overlapping there, and I'll explain that, but there is some significant differences that we want to talk about. So sex, when we think about the word sex, and I'm using that as a biological category that represents male and female. Okay, so sex is a biological category that represents male and female. Male and female are biological categories to which we are assigned at birth based on our chromosomal structure, genitalia, hormones, and the like. So when we're born, all of us, so if you have a little baby, nowadays, we pretty much, most parents know the gender or the sex of their baby before the baby is born, right? We have these, what they call these gender reveal parties, which has become a big thing in some communities. But when I was carrying my children and when my mother was carrying her children, they didn't know till the baby came here what they were having. And so when the baby is born, the first thing you want to know is, what do I have? Is it a boy or a girl? And essentially the doctor or the attending midwife or whoever is supporting you in delivering the baby will make that determination, or you will as the mother, based on the genitalia, based on whether the baby appears physically to be, based on his genitals, a boy or a girl. And so at that point, if you're in the hospital, the determination is made, this is a male child or it's a female child, and that's what your birth certificate will read. So when we think about this idea, though, in our country, how sex is determined, there's really this underlying biological part of it that we don't always know or understand. So our chromosome is really what we use at a first level past the genitalia to determine if someone is male or female. So what's a female? A chromosomal XX. A male is XY. This basic biology, you may have forgotten, but we learned this back in probably in middle school, 7th or 8th grade, somewhere around then. So a female biologically should have an XX chromosome, and a male would have an XY chromosome. And we get one from XX from our mom, and then we get an X or Y from our father, which determines whether we are then born male or female. However, it seems kind of straightforward, but when babies are born, no one tests children in this country to see what their chromosomes are. They're only determined if they're male or female based on what you can see. What's their genitalia? And so that's the kind of the entryway to determining at birth if a child is male or female. However, it's more complicated than that. You know, I wish I could say that was the end story, but it's far more complicated than that. And most of us have no idea how complex that is. And I only know because it's my field of study. That's the only reason I know. I was sharing with my daughter last night that if I had not entered this field of study, I would probably have no clue about some of these terms or what some of this means, because it would not be what I was familiar with. I would be probably as confused about a lot of these terms as a lot of people that I encounter in our community. So let me just say something about biology first, so we can get a little clear understanding of what biology is, because we think of biology and it's a branch of knowledge that deals with living organisms, and it deals with life. Basically, biology is the study of life, living things. So it's a science, it's a natural science. And for the most part in our Western world, we view science as something that's objective, that's absolute, that we can look to and trust it to give us answers. Because after all, it's science. I mean, it's not like someone's opinion or something that, you know, someone has made some determination based on their own view, but we think of it as being objective. And, you know, I think to some degree, some scientists may attempt to be objective, but in all honesty, there's no field of study that is without subjectivity. So even biology and biologists bring to the study their subjectivity, meaning their own interpretation of what they're viewing. And that's why within even the field of science, within the medical field, you can get different opinions, right? From different doctors, from different scientists. And if it was purely objective, they'd all would see the same thing. They would all would understand it the same way. But because it is not, and often they are not even aware of their subjectivity. Because when we're looking at something, we're bringing all of our own sense or the lens that we're looking through to interpret what we're seeing. So biology, I just want to give you a little bit more on this idea of what biology is, because I think it's important for us to demystify the sciences. Now, I consider myself a social scientist, not a natural scientist. I study society and how communities come together and how we organize as communities. I study theology, so I am a theologian, a social scientist. So I don't study the natural sciences per se, but all of them are interrelated. So there's some degree of understanding what biology is that's necessary in order for me to even understand how society and theology engage with, and spirituality with, the biology. So biology is a branch of knowledge that deals with living organisms and vital processes. I want to cite from an article of a biologist, which is also a feminist scholar, that I've used for like 15 years now in my teaching, where she states that the idea that there are more than two biological sexes is not as recent as it may appear to be, as it may be implied. It emerged, she says, in the early 1990s after feminist critics of science joined forces with an intersex activist movement. Their aim was to prevent reinforcement of the artificial two-sex construct by reforming the practice of surgical intervention. So what is she saying here? This idea that there are only two sexes, which most of us, what are they? There's male and female. What else are there, right? In the beginning, God created what? male and female. Therefore, there are two sexes, right? But pause, push pause on that. Maybe that's not so clear. And so the idea that there's more than two sexes, Anne Foster Sterling was the first feminist biologist that I encountered in my studies and in my teaching. And I said I've used her literature and her research for many years that begin to really open up this notion that it's not as clear as we think, that there's a continuum on which we all exist. And when we think about male and female, with male being say at this end of the spectrum and female perhaps being at that end of the spectrum, all of us are somewhere on that spectrum. And what do I mean by that? I mean that probably none of us here in the US, unless we've had to, for a reason that necessitated it, have had a chromosomal test. Do you know what your chromosome makeup is? Do you? No, we don't know. We don't know. Some countries, I understand now, do test babies and they mark them, they have the chromosomal markers at birth. In the US, we don't do that. But the incidence of deviating from that XX and XY is far more frequent than most of us understand. So let me ask you this. Have any of you ever met someone that was a natural redhead?
No.
That someone that had red hair?
Somebody with red freckles and
Red freckles, maybe not red hair. Well, I actually had a niece, African American, that was born with red hair. Yeah, and I've met other people outside of my race that had red hair. So the frequency, and any of you, those of you that are watching, the frequency, one researcher framed it this way, which I thought was manageable, that the frequency of someone being born and not fitting into one of those real clear, neat chromosomal categories of male and female as we understand them is about as frequently as people are born with red hair, which is not an oddity, right?
Right.
So if you've ever encountered on the train, in your travels, in school, in your work, in your community, on television, and in media, someone with red hair, just think about that. You probably have encountered someone that didn't fit quite so neatly into that biological category of XX or XY. We can be born with variations of that. We can be born and present as a female and be XY. We can be born, someone can be born and present as a male and have XX, or have YO, or have a mosaic pattern, or different variations. So biology, as a determinant of what it means to be male or female, doesn't quite give us the answer. It's far deeper than that. You can present at birth as a female with the genitalia that represents a baby that's a girl. And then at puberty, your body can morph into that of a male. Ah, that sounds like something from a movie. No, it happens. In certain parts of the world, there are greater clusters of that frequency. But you can be born externally appearing to be a female, internally not have the female reproductive organs, but have the male organs, and vice versa. So there's all different complex ways that someone can be born a human being. And so determining someone's sex biologically at birth requires far more investigation than just looking at their genitalia. And I think that's the point that we want to make here, that it's not just about what you see biologically. And even if you do all those chromosomal tests and you do all those other things, it's still far deeper than that. So then where do you fit that person? Who and what are they? How do you fit on that spectrum? How are you limiting the range of possibilities of what it means to be a human being when you're force fitting someone into a category that biologists, or some, not all, have said, this is what it means to be a male, this is what it means to be a female biologically. So even from a biological scientific perspective, determining male or female, my point is that it's not as simple as we probably would like for it to be. Because we like easy answers. We don't want things to be messy. We don't want things to be complex. Is there some simple answer to this? There isn't. So biology is complex, and depending upon the scientists that you are studying, or that you're reading, or their own subjectivity or their own perspective on this, they have varying different views about it. So let's look at what is the difference between sex. When I say sexy, I'm talking about biology, and then this idea of gender. So we're all familiar with the term gender. Yes? Okay. So when we think about gender, and again, I was sharing with my youngest, who will be 36 in a few weeks. I was sharing with her as I was preparing my lesson last night that gender is really a term, or gender identity is really a term that's a modern term. So when I was growing up, and I'm a child of the 50s, when I was growing up and prior to my generation, the term gender would not have been a commonplace term. This generation were born into a world where gender had become popularized. But let's just look at these differences first, so I don't get ahead of myself. Gender refers to one way of thinking about gender. Gender refers to the social categories. By social, I mean how they are constructed, not biologically, but how they are constructed based on how do we think about ourselves. So for example, the clothes we wear, how do we have relationships, what occupations we may pursue, how athletic we are, or what sports we engage in, our physical strength, our emotional expressions. Generally speaking, in society, in our society, we think of women having this wide range of emotions that we permit women, if I can use that term, to express. But for men, we've given more attention to this lately, but for the most part, for our boys and for men, we reduce that range of emotions to them. And we'll say, oh, you're acting like if you are acting to emotion, right? We don't really permit that range of emotions to the male gender in society, except for anger. We don't want an angry woman, but the expectation that anger is something, an emotion that men will express, is something that's more commonly or has been historically accepted. We'll tell little boys, they're playing at 9, 10 years old, a sport, and they get hurt. We'll tell them to man up, stop crying, you're acting like a little girl, or we'll use some other very unkind words, and we'll say, you gotta be tough. But for a little girl, we'll say, it's all right, it's gonna be okay, because we allow those range of emotions. So that's what I mean when I talk about social categories. So it has to do with movement. How do you walk? How do you move through the world? How do you sit? How do you occupy this body that you are in? I used to do an exercise with my students where I would tell them just pause, freeze, however they were sitting, and I may have 25, 30 students in the classroom. And I would just say, pause, freeze, and just look around at how everyone is sitting. And generally I'd have about maybe half guys, maybe a little less, and then half girls. But almost always, without exception, the guys would be sitting wide-legged. And the girls, whether they had on pants or dress, would be sitting like you are, with your legs closed. But where does that come from? Is that a natural way to sit? Or are we taught that? Or do we learn that? So even movement, how we are comfortable or not comfortable in our bodies, how we feel as we move through this world, and we don't even think about it. Our posture, how we enter a room, we don't even think about it, because once we've learned this, around the time we're learning language, we forget that we've learned it, and it just becomes a part of who we are. And we can't even remember not knowing that. So let's look at the even intellectual capacity, and that is changing rapidly. But there was a time, and not so long ago in my lifetime, when many people thought in the field of sciences and STEM that women did not have the intellectual capacity to do these kind of complex scientific or mathematical equations. They thought women's brain bandwidth just couldn't do that, because somehow biologically the female gender's brain was very different from the male gender brain, and it could not do those things. We've changed that significantly over the years. But let's look at the origin of the word gender and its current uses, because as I said, gender really became used in our vocabulary to refer to male, female categories of difference beginning around the middle of 1950s, around the time I was born. But it did not become even popularized in terms of our frequency of use until we get into around the 90s. So it's really a more common expression. And I thought about this. This is when I was in school, I never remember learning anything about gender. Around middle school, you learned about sex. High school, you had sex education. But the word gender, the term gender, wasn't a term that I was familiar with until I went to college, and actually until I went to grad school later on. And I entered into this field of study. So before the 1950s, the term gender was used only in the field of grammar. The root word of gender just means categories. It means a kind or a type in its genetic form. But a fellow named John Mooney, and I want to talk a little bit about him. I don't know if any of you've heard of him. John Mooney, and he was a psychologist, a scientist, a sexologist, and a professor at Johns Hopkins University. And he coined the term gender, a gender role, and popularized the word gender identity in a paper that he wrote in 1955. It happens actually to be the year that I was born. And he defined gender role as all those things that a person says or does to disclose himself or herself as having the status of boy, girl, or woman. So, for example, when I was growing up, and still in some communities now, once that birth identity of male or female, boy or girl, has been inscribed on your birth certificate or your parents have determined that, the process of genderizing that child and socializing that child into what it means to be a boy or girl, now with the gender reveals, that begins even before birth. Because now you don't have to wait until the baby is born to know what the sex is going to be or the gender. And we use that term interchangeably, and it's really not interchangeably. But what are some of the things that we do to socialize the child? What's one of the first initial things?
When we identify as a child.
Yeah, color coding.
Yeah, maybe.
Blue for boys, pink for
Big
girls. What about, you said names?
Names.
Naming, we have some names that can go both ways, but for the most part, the name will let you know if it's a male or female. What about toys?
Mm-hmm.
Right? Toys. So we begin clothing.
Mm-hmm.
We begin very early games that they play, how they play. We begin very early on, sensitizing that child and teaching that child what their assigned role, how it should be represented.
Mm-hmm.
So they don't come here necessarily knowing that, but society has determined, and for our culture, what that means. Now, it's important to note that how males and females have represented themselves historically have been different over time, and has been different geographically, and it has been different culturally. So one of the things, for example, I tell when we just said one of the color coding ways that we color our babies is through pink and blue, right? Mm-hmm. Pink for girls, blue for boys. Well, in the late 1800s, the color for boys was pink. The color for girls was blue. So these things are not based in biology or any abstract or absolute truth. It's how we construct them. Even I tell us, shared with my students, and I've shared this in the past, in my religious organization, my church, where growing up, pants, slacks were not permitted in church. I never wore pants to church until I was a grown woman, a fully grown woman, I said, a fully grown woman. because women didn't wear pants. That wasn't a part of our gender role. However, if you trace out and study the history of pants, pants were first designed for men. I mean, for women. Men wouldn't wear them because they were considered feminine. And as they became useful, or the utility of them became useful during wartime, then men began to wear them. And if men were wearing them, so now women can't, because we have to keep these roles separate. So if they're masculine, and if we're masculine, making it a masculine item of clothing, then women cannot wear it. So over time, how we represent in a particular gender based on these external categories shifts and changes. So I want you to just get that and understand that. So going back to Mooney. So Mooney's work in the 1950s and in the 60s was groundbreaking. He opened up this field of gender and studying gender identity. And he really was doing on the heels of, and I talked about Alfred Kinsey a little bit last week. Alfred Kinsey was a trailblazer in opening up the field of study into sex and sexuality, and moving it from a pure medical model to a social scientific model. But Mooney, following after Kinsey, parsed out this notion of what does it mean to be a sexual being, and how does one's gender represent something more than one's biology? How are the two related, but how are they not necessarily the same? And so Mooney, in his research, began to think about how is gender developed? How do we begin to understand what does it mean to be this male or a female person? Is that just biology? And his argument, his assertion was that it was more than biology and not just biology. In fact, for Mooney, he thought that gender was like language. Whatever we were exposed to by 18 months or so is what we will learn. Okay, where you were born and what the language of your parents are. Remove that child from that environment and place it in a totally different environment, pre-18 months or pre-2 years old, and that child will pick up that language or whatever they're hearing. And they'll learn that language, they'll think in that language, their reality will be framed by that language. And even though they can learn multiple languages, but their dominant language will be the language that they are exposed to very early in life. So he thought and believed that gender was similar to that it wasn't at all a function of biology. That is how we are socialized, that gender then is formed. So Mooney's research, as I said, was trailblazing, but there were some problems. It was problematic in many ways. And let me just share a little bit about one of his popular research studies that you may have heard of and may not. There's a documentary that was done about this. You could probably Google it, maybe on YouTube, maybe streaming as an old documentary on one of the streaming sites. But Mooney was the first one that did gender reassignment surgery. And he did a case study on a set of twins. There was a set of twins, boys, born biologically boys. And one of the little boys, his name was David. When the doctors were performing the circumcision on him, and the circumcision is usually done nowadays before the baby leaves the hospital. I think then it was probably before they turned 12 months old. But during the circumcision, the doctors severely damaged his penis, severely. And at that point, Mooney counseled the parents, and in consultation with the doctors, suggested, based on what his research was, and again, what his idea of gender and sex was, and the relationship between biology and gender, that to do the reassignment surgery, meaning you've already severely damaged this boy's anatomy, his sex organ is non-functional. So at this point, let's just do a reconstructive surgery to change this little boy's body into that of a little girl. And so they did that. This is around 1965. And the counsel or the reason what Mooney argued was that the baby is still young. The baby will heal physically, and to the parents, raise the child, even though it was a 20, the little brother, raise this little boy as a girl. The same way you would have raised the child if you'd had twins and one was a boy and one was a girl. And so Mooney, over the next decade or so, had regular counseling sessions and did his research, and he would meet with both of the little children as they grew up. And his research notes and what he published suggested that this worked. That little Bruce, little David, who they changed his name, raised him as a girl from that point on, was well adapted and was living like a little girl. The truth is that's not what happened. Somewhere, even though David had no memory of what happened, he was too young to remember that. Somewhere pre-puberty, around 9 or 11, and all of us hit puberty at different stages. And sometimes we don't think boys go through that, because girls, we have this marker of puberty, right? We get our menses, and so something's very significant happens, and now you're changing. But for boys, they go through that also. So when he hits around 9 or 11, he begins to feel like he's not a girl, that he's a boy. And he's wants to live like a boy and act like a boy. And by the time he's 15, he's living like a boy, even though his body has surgically been changed because of the accident very on to make him a boy, to make him a girl. Well, the sad story is that he struggled throughout his life and eventually committed suicide when he was about 38, before he turned 40. And his twin brother, I think, died of a drug overdose. So they both were traumatized by this. But later researchers at Johns Hopkins and others looked at Mooney's research and was able to critically show how it was flawed. I mean, the experiment that he was attempting did not measure up to the reality of what was happening. But since then, how case studies are done, how we study human beings and human communities is better regulated and more oversight to it than it was during that time and even prior to him. But what's important to take away from that is that even though his study was flawed, what he did not work as he was attempting to do, it continued to open up this field, though, for other researchers to study what is the connection between biology and between gender. And so the idea now is that for the most part, not necessarily based on what one is exposed to, but a combination of your biology, your genetic marking, and how you are hardwired when you enter this world, and what some call the nature-nurture combination, that by the time you're 3 years old, for the most part, most of us have settled into our bodies in a sense of what that means to be in these sexed bodies, biologically and from a gender perspective. And even if you try to change that, it doesn't work very well. The most part is not, by the time between 3 and puberty, I mean, that is pretty much evident as to how that child appears. Now, what I'm suggesting here is that gender also is fluid like biology. So because someone is in a gender identified as female, and they're comfortable being female, I'm using that as one example, all females don't appear the same way. I have 4 girls and they're all different. One is a girly girl, stiletto, high heel girl. The other is a tomboyish, you would say, sneaker, sweat cap, and all girl. They're all girls. And they identify as girls. I have another daughter, and I was laughing because when 2 of them went to prom the same year, sent them out, they went out and they went in the limo, they were all decked up and beautiful. One came back, looked like a princess. The other one came back with like she'd been rolling around in the dirt. Like, what the heck? What the heck happened to you? But that's just who she is. You know, she's not the girly girl person. You're not gonna see her walking around in these stilettos. But yet she identifies as a girl, as a female. So all girls do not present the same way. You know, all guys do not present the same way. And so when we understand, so what does it mean then to be in either of these categories? So let me go on, because we only got a few minutes left, I think, based on when we started. Number 4, how is gender determined? I got 2 more. One more that I have to do after this. Let's look at this question. How is one's gender determined? Let's just investigate that a little bit more. In the conventional sense, one's gender is assigned at birth. I went over that based on the exterior examination of the baby's genitals. It is commonly thought that one's gender is based on their chromosome. However, chromosomal testing of babies is not routinely done. We know that doesn't happen here in the US. I understand Scandinavia does this, if you want to look that up. It is possible to present physically with male genitalia and have XX chromosomes, and I shared that. It is also likewise to physically present as a female and have XY chromosomes. There are several different schools of thought, this is what I want to get to, as to how gender is developed. And so even within the field of gender studies, within the field of feminist studies, within the field of queer, LGBTQIA, transgender studies, there isn't one way of understanding this. And I don't take that as a negative. I take that as this is a field that's emerging. It's knowledge that's being uncovered. We're learning more about what it means to be a human being. And at least we're having the conversation and we're willing to engage with one another with differing views. And that's important because we can't move through this process of coming to knowledge that we didn't know previously if we're not willing to sit in the conflicts and the differences. So one of the schools of thought about how gender is developed is essentialists, who hold that gender identity is fixed at birth by genetic or other biological factors. So those essentialists would be those who are believe that socialization has nothing to do with it, except for some would argue that it damages potentially or could spoil the child. But basically your gender is fixed at the time of birth, and that's based on biology, and there's no changing that. And any change of that is some kind of dysfunction. Then there's the social constructivists who hold that gender identity or the manner in which gender identity is expressed is socially constructed, determined by social and cultural influences. So this was what I just shared about Mooney, is that your gender is like language, what you're exposed to is what you will take on, and it is not based in your biology, but it's based more in how society constructs that and the environment around which you live. Then there's another school, and there are more than these. I'm just giving you a few because, as I said, I can't really go through this whole field of study. This study that I'm doing, this lecture series, is just somewhat to whet the appetite of the listeners, to open the curiosity to say, I didn't know that. Let me find out more about this. Let me be a little bit more open to understanding what I thought I knew, but now I realize I don't know. So that's what the purpose of this study is about. So this idea of performatism, which is a slight variation of social constructivism, holds that gender identity is constituted rather than expressed by the continuous performance of gendered behavior, actions, and speech. There's a feminist philosopher, and she wears many different academic hats, her name is Judith Butler, who argued that gender is performatively constituted by the very expressions that are said to be its result. That really, none of these really give us a clear understanding, a meaning of what gender is, except that it's about expression, it's connected to biology in some way. It's also, it's important how we are hardwired biologically, but that's not the be all and end all of how our gender expression will be. So gender expression can vary, and there's no one way to be gendered in a particular biological category. Okay, so number 5, as we come to the end. As we end this lecture for today, we have a final question, and that question is, does biology drive gender, or does gender drive biology? So that's what we've been talking about. Does biology drive gender? Does biology determine the gender? Or does gender in some way determine the biology? How can gender determine biology when biology is a science and that's somewhat fixed? Well, remember, I started by saying that's not so clear. We think about being a human being and what it means to be a biological being. Ann Foster Sterling, who I shared from her when we begin this lecture today, said that biology, gender is always changing the biology, quoting from her. Gender is always changing the biology, meaning what? Meaning that we are evolutionary beings. When you trace out our human experience, we are changing all the time. We're changing. To the degree that we use different parts of our bodies in different ways, develop different muscles, we use different brain width. For example, we look at our babies now that are born and we say that they are just technologically intuitive. You know, 2 years old almost, they know how to operate smart devices, right? And I'm still trying to figure out a lot of it. But it's a part of their brain that's being activated at a very early stage. Very early stage. How is that changing who they are? Every time we change one part of us or expand one part of our capacity as a human being, we essentially are changing the biology. It doesn't go back to being what it was. So as we are evolving, and as you develop, muscle capacity, or you develop the ability to do, something in a particular field, or you learn certain knowledge, all of that is increasing what it means for you as an individual, but for us as a community, what it means to be a human being. And so to that extent, when we think about it, gender as a social construct, or how society is shaping and informing and framing and moving biology, we're always doing that. The world that I live in is not the world my mother and grandmother lived in. They wouldn't understand it if they came back here now. And it would be hard for them to function in it. I'm just talking from the technological perspective. I grew up, we had how many channels on the television? 2, 4, 5, 7, 9, 11, 13. And the TV went off at 2 a.m. So there was nothing to watch all night long. And we were fully occupied and entertained with those few channels. Now I think I have like 1,400 channels on my television, and most of the time I can't find anything to watch. It's a different world. We are very different beings from what our ancestors were. Our children, in real time, we see this happening in front of our eyes. Our children and our grandchildren are becoming people and tapping into parts of themselves that we don't fully understand, right? And so for some, that's very scary. And of course it is. My great-grandmother, God rest her soul, Grandma Carolyn, it was my grandmother's mother. I never met her. She died when my mom was a young girl. But the story that my mom would tell is that Grandma Carolyn never had electric lights in her house. She lit her house by kerosene lamp. And when my mom she raised my grandmother in a house with kerosene lamps. But when my grandmother moved out and she got older, electric lights had came. And they were, middle class at that time. And so they had a house with electric lights, but Grandma Carolyn still had kerosene lights. Grandma Carolyn didn't understand electricity. And she did not want to be in the house if the electric lights were on, because it was mysterious to her. She didn't understand how that worked. She was comfortable with the kerosene lights, and she died only having kerosene lamps light her house, even though electricity was available. because it was too fearful for her to embrace what was changing. And I think that for our generation now, part of what I see that's happening in our world is that we are fastly changing. We are evolving as a human species at lightning speed. And not just the older ones from my generation, some of us are stuck. And I may have been too if I had not pursued this field of study professionally. But many of us are stuck, not all of us, but some young folks also are stuck. We have many that are stuck in a place because they're fearful of what's changing. And I don't say, criticize that to the degree that it's not fearful. Anytime when your reality feels unstable, that's fearful. When what you believe to be real no longer feels like it's real, that is threatening. It feels threatening and it feels fearful. One way of looking at it is that this is something terrible. We have to try to fight to remain where we were, or to keep things from changing because this is leading to something that's doomsday. Or we can embrace it as this is something wonderful. This is a new horizon. This is a new way of being that we're being presented with on the spectrum of what does it mean to be a human being, that we can all open ourselves up to the newness of this and embrace what's coming. I don't know what the world will look like when my grandson, who will be 19 in a few days, when he's 50. I don't know what the world will look like. I don't know how we will be different significantly in terms of what it means to be a human being, but I know we're changing. I know it won't be the same way we was when I was a child, when I was 19, or even when I turned 50. And how do we then collectively pull together to go through these transitions, creating spaces that are loving, that are safe, that are embracing, and saying, even if I don't understand all the science, even if I don't understand all the sociology, even if I don't understand all these complex things you've been talking about today, I'm willing to inhale and exhale and move with the movement. I'm willing to say, let's take this human journey together and see where we end. As I close, I thought about this idea from scripture within our Christian and many Judeo-Christian tradition. And if our starting point, that's all right, brother, I'll be finished in just a few minutes. Bless you. If our starting point in our understanding about gender is that God created humankind as male and female. I mean, if that's our starting point, and that's okay if it is, but I would suggest that in thinking about that, you have to be open to consider that even from that perspective, that evolution was taking place. What do I mean by that? If we look more deeply into our beliefs about the creation story, we can see embedded in the Genesis account a metaphorical view of the story of evolution. So Genesis 1:27, familiar passage of scripture for some of you. So God created man in his own image, in the image of God created he him, male and female created he them. Okay, hold that. Fast forward to Genesis 2:21-23. And Adam gave names to all cattle and to the fowl of the air, to every beast of the field. But for Adam there was found not a helpmeet for him. And then the Lord God caused a deep sleep to fall upon Adam, and he slept. And he took one of his ribs and closed it with flesh instead thereof. And the rib which the Lord God had taken from the man made he a woman and brought her unto the man. And Adam said, this is now bone of my bones and flesh of my flesh. She should be called woman because she was taken out of man. Okay, so if we think about that metaphorically, knowing that this is not a historical account of how the world and humans begin, but think about it metaphorically. Let us consider that it's no longer good for us to exist in these binary categories that we've created. It's not working. It's not working for a large percentage of the population. We haven't understood what it means, and we have to be willing to acknowledge We have not understood what it means to be a male and a female. We force fit people into categories of difference that worked or were convenient for the ruling classes and a way of controlling people. But it no longer works. So that the divine, whatever you call God or goddess or Allah, however you understand the divine, is calling us to the next stage of human evolution. That we're being pulled and pushed and beckoned to move on. Perhaps that is why it seems that so many of us have fallen into a deep sleep. That this progression, this evolution, this change requires some of us to fall asleep while it's taking place, because it is too much for us to bear. And either we can't see what is changing, or the struggle is too much for us to really endure it. But it's happening all around us. Whether we go with it or we stand on the side, life and time never change. Evolution will not stop. We're moving to the next phase of what it means to be a human being. We're going to end here for this week. Next week is the holiday, it's 4th of July. So we will not be open. We'll pick up lecture number 4 on July the 11th. So we'll make sure, Sister Jessica, we'll let the community know. I'll put a note on the door and I'll put it on our social media page. We will not be holding the lecture series or Tai Chi that week. We'll be back the week of the 11th. And next, when we come back in 2 weeks, we're going to pick up with lesson number 3. And our topic is going to be sexuality as an expression of the human condition and the divine connection between spirituality and sexuality. All right, so thank you for watching. Thank you for being with us. Those that joined us by social media, thank you for being here. Those that joined in the community, thank you for being here. We're just going to close this out and seal it with an offering of prayer. We give thanks for this time that we've had together, this time that we've had to share with one another, this time we've had to learn. Thank you for the impartation and the flowing through me and in me and out of me, the knowledge that has been granted and given to me. And they spread beyond just the confines of this building and those that are here and those that are on social media. But these words like spirit will go out into the community, that it will lift, it will elevate, and it will ignite someone to reconsider and rethink who they are and how they are to be in this world. May we all strive to create loving, sacred, safe spaces that we all may continue this divine process of becoming fully what we're created to be. Amen and Ashe. Thank you.